If you're an athlete that does long, arduous endurance events, especially in hot weather, then having a good understanding of how much sodium or salt you lose in your sweat is very, very important. For me, I learnt this the hard way because I have a very high sweat rate and I have a very high sweat sodium concentration. And when I was competing in long events like Ironmans in the heat, I would often see my performance deteriorate in the second half of the event, sometimes to the point where I didn't finish the event because of fluid and salt loss. Now, the reason this is important to understand on an individual level is that everyone's sweat rates are very, very different and everyone's sweat sodium concentrations are very, very different. So at the extreme end, some people can lose very little sweat and also lose very little salt in that sweat. And at the other end, people like myself can have extremely high sweat rates and lose lots and lots of sodium in their sweat. When we measure athletes' sweat sodium output using our advanced sweat test, we can see anything from 200 milligrams of sodium per litre in very dilute sweat through to 2000 milligrams of sodium per litre in very salty sweat. So the range is absolutely huge. Now, if you can't have an advanced sweat test, it doesn't mean that you can't sort of start to look into this area for yourself and start to figure out where you might sit on that spectrum, because sweat sodium composition is relatively stable within an individual, even though it varies quite a lot from person to person. So if you show certain characteristics, then you can often use those as a sign of whether you're losing more or less salt than average. Then when you've figured that out, you can start to play around with whether your replacement strategy for salts and fluids is going to be better on the lighter end, or whether you're going to be pushing it more towards the aggressive end. Now, there's 6 kind of areas to look at when you're estimating your sweat loss, and I'm going to go through them here and talk about them one by one. Step 1 is looking at salt marks on your kit and clothing. Now, this was always a very obvious one for me. If I run in the heat, especially if I've got a hat and especially if it's black, then I will see salt marks after a relatively short amount of time, especially if the weather's warm and dry, because the fluid from the sweat evaporates, leaving salt crystals behind. It was the same on my bike helmet straps. Round here and round here, they would absorb some sweat, it evaporates away and leaves a lot of salt behind. In extremely hot conditions, I'd even see salt in my eyebrows and on my skin. So if you're someone who regularly sees that, then that can be a really big sign that you are actually losing quite a lot of salt in your sweat. Number 2 is thinking about whether your sweat tastes very salty and whether it stings in your eyes and whether it stings in cuts and grazes and that sort of thing, because sweat which has a very high salt content often does that. It can feel like it's burning when it drips into your eyes, or if you've got cuts on your hands or on your face and it gets into them, it'll really, really sting and be sore. So that's often something to look out for as well. The third thing to look for is something called postural hypertension. Now, that's a fancy way of saying feeling faint and dizzy when you stand up quickly. And the reason that can occur if you're losing a lot of salt is because when you sweat and you lose salt and fluid, it can reduce your blood volume. And if you've got lower blood volume, when you go from a lying or seated position to standing up rapidly, sometimes the blood flow drops towards the lower part of your body, starves the brain of oxygen, you can feel a bit faint and dizzy. Again, for me, that was a real sign. I used to get that a lot in the summer. After long, hard training sessions, I'd maybe lie down on the couch to recover for a while, stand up and feel faint and dizzy, and I even remember once or twice actually fainting. So if that happens to you on a reasonably frequent basis, that can be another sign that you're losing quite a lot of salt as well as a lot of fluid. Number 4 is muscle cramps. Now, there's a lot of argument about what causes muscle cramps, but we see a very strong trend in people that lose a lot of salt in their sweat. If you get cramps late on in long races, after long training sessions, especially in hot weather, if you're a frequent cramper, that can be a sign that you're losing a lot of salt as well. Number 5 is quite a subjective one. But if you really think about how you feel about exercising in the heat and how you tend to perform in the heat compared with people that you would perform against in cooler conditions, if you always feel terrible in the heat, if you don't like racing and competing in the heat, you don't recover very well, then that can also be a sign that maybe salt losses are higher for you than in others, and that's what's making it a little bit more difficult. Point 6 is craving salt. Now, your body is very finely tuned to keeping your salt balance adequate, and if you start to find that you're craving salt, particularly after long or hard workouts or when you're under a heavy training load, that's your body's way of telling you that you're losing quite a lot of salt and that maybe you need to replace a little bit more. So that's probably the final one to look out for. Now, none of these on their own are guaranteed signs that you have got very salty sweat, but in combination, if you've heard those 6 points and are thinking like 3, 4, 5, 6 of them apply to you, there's an increasing likelihood that you are losing a little bit more salt in your sweat than average. And the best thing to do about that is then to try and experiment with taking a little bit more sodium with fluids when you're exercising, especially in the heat, and seeing how that affects your performance. The Precision Hydration product range has 500, 1,000 or 1,500 milligrams of sodium in per litre, and for people who are losing more than the average amount of salt in their sweat, we recommend starting out with the 1,000 or 1,500 milligram products because they give you a higher sodium to fluid ratio and often work really well for those of us who lose a bit more salt in our sweat.